since brevity is the soul of wit.
More of your conversation would infect my brain.
Romeo, wherefore art thou Romeo?
To speak of him as my kinsman, he's a most notable coward, an infinite and endless liar, an hourly promise breaker, the owner of no one good quality worthy your lordship's entertainment.
I'd beat thee, but I should infect my hand.
The lady doth protest too much, methinks.
The course of true love never did run smooth.
I'm Aidan.
I'm Lindsay.
And you're joining us here on the Bicks pod, talking Shakespeare and the Taming of the Shrew.
Yes.
And to start us off, Lindsay has the honor this time of giving us a 30-second plot synopsis.
This went so well last time.
So well.
Aidan.
I got through 1/20th of the story. Let's see if you
maybe
can do better.
Go through an act, right?
Yeah, maybe. So we'll aim for better than that. And
William Shakespeare's Taming of the Shrew.
Yes, you have 30 seconds. We have a timer ready. You can start now.
All right, so we have a father, 2 daughters. One is beautiful and charming. The other is shrewish and mean. He will not allow the charming one to marry until the eldest shrewish one is married. Enter Petruchio, a man who decides he is going up for the challenge. He marries Katharina and tames her, possibly by the end of the play. Is that the end? I missed the whole comic subplot. I really did. 30 seconds is not a long time.
It is really not. It is
wow.
not a good time.
It's really not. It's really not good.
You got the gist of it.
Yeah.
It's that dynamic of the older sister has to be married before the younger one does, and shenanigans ensue. Basically, is what.
See, that would have been so much better. Boy meets girl. Girl rebuffs boy, shenanigans ensue. Yeah. That really should have been what I said.
Well, you were close. You were most of the way there, and much better than I did previous on The Two Gentlemen of Verona. So well done. That is the play we're talking about. There is a comic subplot. There are multiple marriages, as was the case with a lot of Shakespeare's comedies.
Yep.
But this play is notable for a couple of reasons. First of all, the Shrew character is kind of an archetype.
Later plays in the Jacobean period and into the Restoration would have the fop and the dandy and whatnot. Now you have this Shrew character that doesn't. I mean, I suppose there is still Shrew-like characters around. Yeah. There are characters like that around today, but we don't call them Shrews, so it's hard to. You tell someone, oh, the Taming of the Shrew, and they picture the marmot-like, vole-like creature that,
yes.
Lives in burrows. I don't know what shrews are.
I don't know what shrews are either.
But it's not really commonly understood today as a thing, but it was at the time. The shrew was a very common character.
Yeah, and so that kind of archetype has carried on through the ages and come down to us and various other characters. The overbearing wife, in every sitcom,
or just sometimes even just the opinionated woman.
Yes, yes, exactly. That's
with post second wave feminism or even post first wave feminism. That's kind of the character that we deal with today.
Yeah, and it's interesting in the context of the play because this is not the first Shrew play that existed at the time period.
Do tell, Aidan.
Or perhaps it was. So there is, if you read about this play at all, you will learn that there is actually another version of this play, potentially, called The Taming of a Shrew. And the version that we have here today is from the first folio, and it is The Taming of the Shrew. And it's the generally agreed upon Shakespeare canon. It is the Shakespearean play. It has a lot of his kind of typical wordplay, and we'll get into some of that in the future. But Taming of a Shrew has some unique differences. They both have that play within a play narrative. There's the Christopher Sly character at the start of Taming of the Shrew, who gets told that this play is being put on for you, master, because you're kind of being gaslit into believing that you're a nobleman today. But in Taming of the Shrew, the Shakespeare folio version, that plot just disappears after the first act. It never comes back. Taming of a Shrew has those characters return a couple more times, including at the end. There's an interesting turnabout that we can talk about. A Shrew also featured different names for characters, a few twists of who got with who and how it all worked out. But for the most part, it matched very closely with Taming of the Shrew.
To the point that people often wonder if this is maybe an earlier version of the Shrew that Shakespeare wrote, that maybe Shakespeare had a hand in writing a Shrew or something. Or
there's three basic different theories. One is that someone either was remembering the Shrew play and just wrote it down or the possibility that it was an entirely different play, or if at some point Shakespeare either edited a Shrew into the Shrew, or it just got refined over the years as was being performed, and then the final version is the one that
I kind of like the idea that this is almost like a bad quarto version of the Shrew. That a Shrew is like the bad quarto version of Romeo and Juliet that surfaces every once in a while, but. It's an interesting play. I didn't read it. I just read the synopsis, and I was especially interested in the way that the Christopher Sly frame narrative kind of wraps up in that one, which is, I think we'll talk about that a little bit more when we get to it. But I think diving into that historical context, coming back to the Shrew and this idea that women at the time were supposed to be chaste, silent, and obedient. Yes, chaste meaning, virginal and I don't know how else do you describe
uncorrupted,
chaste?
I guess.
Yeah,
it's not just sexual, although it is primarily sexually concerned with sex, but it's also just protecting your virtue and being a kind woman as well is considered part of your chastity. Yeah,
silence obviously meaning not one to have opinions, to be silent and to be obedient. So to obey first your father as the lord of the household you grew up in, and then your husband eventually when you get married. And it was assumed that everybody would get married, which is what makes Taming of the Shrew so interesting. Is Katharina is unable to be married, and it becomes a burden. It's understood to be a burden on her poor, suffering Bianca, who her name even means white. Like Bianca, she's so chaste,
she's so pure,
that her name is pure. Yeah. And this is this terrible burden because her sister is unmarriageable. Yeah. Bianca can't be married, and so it's not just a burden for Katharina, which it certainly would have been. It's a burden on her father, Baptista Minola, who has to support his daughter into her probably early 20s. Yeah. At that time, that would have been spinster.
So old. Yeah, exactly.
And then also poor Bianca, who can't get married. So it's this whole idea that marriage is the be-all, end-all for a woman, and when that can't be achieved for whatever reason, society kind of falls apart, or at least the social structure of the family and the web that comes out from that kind of falls apart.
And that's interesting to contrast with kind of the way the Elizabethan social structure was kind of changing as Shakespeare was writing and through into the Jacobean period, where women became and their chastity and silence and obedience became a really big topic because for a couple of reasons. Number one being the fact that there was a queen. The monarch and the head of the Church of England was a woman. Yeah. And this was confusing in an era when women were supposed to be silent, chaste, and obedient. Queen Elizabeth, of course, was chaste. Famously.
Ostensibly.
Yes, ostensibly.
I'm sure she got it out.
At least never married. So, I mean, as far as anyone considered, she was kind of the perfect woman in that sense. But the other two categories, it was impossible for her. She could be obedient to nobody but God, I guess, which is fine, I guess. And she probably played on that quite a bit. But silent, I mean, she was the leader of the country. She had to lead them into battles against Spain and against persecution of religions and wars with Scotland and all sorts of things, right? So there was this kind of contradiction in this ideal perfected woman as silent, chaste, and obedient, and the monarch who they all owed allegiance to being, not.
Which is interesting because she did famously reign as a king almost. She didn't want to give up any of that power by marrying, which is one of the reasons why she didn't marry. But she didn't. I mean, it's not like cross-dressing, but that comes into play in Shakespeare's plays as well. And I think that we can talk about that in relation to how he wanted to portray women stepping out of the traditional bounds to a queen who liked his plays. Yeah. he wanted to portray this in a positive way. And the only way for a woman to get that power was to cross-dress and be a man, which is kind of what Elizabeth did. She did become a man, really, you know, unsexed almost, to become a ruler in this great line of kings going back to 1066, right? So that is interesting. Of course, in this play that doesn't happen, but it still is interesting to see a different interpretation of how a woman might be able to behave.
Yeah, and it's interesting because Katharina is actually, as far as we can tell, I mean, again, I mentioned that chastity meant more than just sex, but in terms of sex, there's no hint that Katharina had previous lovers.
No.
So in that way, she's very similar to Queen Elizabeth.
Right.
She's not silent or obedient, but she is
chaste.
Ostensibly chaste.
Yeah.
And depending on how the play is read, she's very protective of that chastity. When Petruchio comes knocking, even she's not really receptive.
Yeah.
Depending on how it's portrayed. So it's interesting that there is kind of a parallel there between the Shrew, this character of, you know, bad morals, and the Queen. And, you know, I don't know if that was intended or if it would have even been noticed at the time.
No, that is interesting, though.
But it is something there that kind of complicates the reading of the whole play because as the play goes on, and we'll talk about this a bit more, but there is a whole lot of the ending of the play is always in question. Is Katharina beaten down and honest with her words at the end, where she talks about, you know, how much obeying, and how much you owe your husband or your father, you know, the male figure in your life, especially your husband, or is it kind of like, oh yeah, you know, you owe your husband everything, like
wink, wink,
/ sarcasm, you know, tag there. So, you know, and there's lots of different ways of reading that ending, and so. You know, does that mean that perhaps was that ambiguity there from the initial point to say, hey, even if you're a woman who's not silent and obedient, say like the Queen, it's okay because as long as you pay lip service to obedience to a man, it's kind of okay. Yeah. I don't know. Do you have any thoughts on that, Lindsay? Did you?
It's not, I mean, I'm hearing this for the first time. We try not to discuss this too much before we get in front of the microphone, just in case we say something really brilliant and then have to replicate it. It's really awkward. So I'm hearing this idea for the first time that there might be some kind of relationship between Katharina and the Queen. It's not something that immediately jumped to mind. I don't see Katharina as a particularly admirable figure or somebody that you would want to draw comparisons to. No. I think, and I think, you know, in the context of the time, this would have been played for laughs, really. Yeah. And so I don't know if that there was like an intention behind it to draw that parallel between Katharina and Queen Elizabeth. But having said that, we don't know what Shakespeare was thinking. This is all conjecture.
Oh, totally.
So it could go either way. But I like the idea that maybe there is some kind of link, and I certainly would consider it.
You'd consider it. Okay. I've reached my maximum point for you. Because if you're considering it, that's a good job for me.
The other thing about the lack of kind of social norms being upheld, you know, we talked about this a little bit earlier too, with the fact that there was social mobility almost for the first time, and you had people of low birth being elevated to gentleman status almost, or actually achieving that in the case of someone like Shakespeare and his family, right? So this idea of social mobility really did cast the society into turmoil, and I think that's reflected a little bit in this as well, in that you have a woman who is, like we said, unmarriageable. Is that a word, unmarriageable?
Sure.
Unmarriable?
Unmarriageable sounds...
Yeah.
Is that an act? Yeah.
I don't know.
I don't know. Sure.
We're going to go with it, though.
We'll go with unmarriageable. Yeah.
She's not someone who you would imagine would get married. And certainly with the construct around this that sets up that comic subplot, it sets up the whole play. It's her father's decree that Katharina cannot, or Bianca can't get married unless Katharina is married. That's it's almost like an artificial social construct. Like there's nothing in the law that says you have to marry off your eldest daughter before you can marry off your younger daughters, although in Regency England and Victorian England you have characters like in Pride and Prejudice, like with all five Bennet sisters out in society at once.
Oh, scandalous.
Oh, right. So I mean, maybe there is something to that, but I don't think that was like a hard and fast law. So here is Baptista Minola, the father, making this decree and trying to set bounds around a woman who is bucking social norms. Yeah. And it almost feels like this is a commentary on how well that's going to go for him, how well that's going to go for Bianca. And although I don't think, like I said, Katharina is not this virtuous figure you want to emulate, Bianca isn't really either. And Baptista is not really either.
That's
like
a good
none
point.
of the characters are really good people that you would want to have in your social circle. And
neither
right?
is Petruchio at all.
Exactly,
He's absolutely
right?
crazy. But that's an interesting point because, I mean, Bianca basically gets engaged and elopes without her father's permission to Lucentio, right? And that's an interesting take because she's not chaste.
No.
You know, she is the epitome. She's Bianca pure, but then she's not. Mm-hmm. And that's kind of an interesting, I hadn't considered that either until just now. That's a good point. And it is interesting because these are, again, kind of the silent, chaste, obedient archetype moral code is being imposed on a world where it's impossible to maintain that. Yeah. Because there is that social mobility, because women are, they're still property and they're still being married off and they have to be married and so on and so forth. But there's a newfound emphasis on this in the culture. Yeah. Because if you were talking about like a medieval period, there wasn't this level of control because the women weren't interacting with men as freely. It was all very, basic economic need of needing to marry, to have kids, to support yourself on the farm. But these are always usually kind of like urban environments that we're in. It was in Two Gentlemen of Verona. They were in Verona. Here it's Padua and Pisa, and they're all from all over northern Italy, right? And they're coming together, and so there's more options for marriage. And once women have more options, you need to control them a little bit more, right? If you're in a patriarchal society.
And even if you give women these choices, there's still, so her father still tries to put these barriers in the way, but then the men who are interested in her find ways around them anyway. Yeah. Right? So, and that's how you get Lucentio pretending to be a scholar, a philosopher, to teach Bianca the whatever. Yeah.
Seems pretty smart.
And Hortensio does the same thing, and they've all got their people in the room to try and woo her. Mm-hmm. They're completely getting around her father's decree anyway. So it's not just the women who are bucking the trends or bucking the norms, the mores, but the men are doing it too. Everybody is doing it too. Yeah. So it's everyone except for the old man who kind of
gives up.
But, and Hortensio gives up too. But in the end, really, it's interesting that it's young people showing absolutely no regard for the social structure of their elders. Yeah. Really, it's kind of a radical play in that respect. I think if you look at it that way, or if you see it that way.
And most of Shakespeare's plays have an element of that. The youthful love triumphing over the social condition that they're underneath. And I thought it was just interesting because it is very similar to the next big moment in English, the next female monarch, Queen Victoria. When she comes to power, there's another whole concern about women's sexuality that kind of takes over the Victorian era, and it's also an era of increased urbanization as well. Yeah. London explodes from whatever 1 million or 500,000 people to whatever big metropolis, right? Yes. And all these other little cities, Manchester, Liverpool, all grow and stuff as well.
Yeah. Interesting that it's when women are on the throne that the greatest periods, and Elizabeth too. You see the great information age come about, and she's presided over all of it. So that just throwing that in there.
Yeah, no, it's interesting because it seems like it's a little bit of happenstance from history, combining with who the monarch is at the time. Yeah. These issues come up so strongly at these points.
All the world's a stage, and all the men and women merely players.
So we wanted to do a little bit of a deep dive into one particular part of the play. It's my favorite part, every time I read it, and when it's performed, it's usually really great to watch.
And it's usually very telling about how they're going to interpret the play as well.
Yes, exactly. It is the back and forth, Petruchio and Katharina meeting for the first time.
Yeah.
And the text itself it's very witty. It's very back and forth. There's a lot of wordplay. It's very Shakespeare. Like it is the jokey Shakespeare that drives high school kids crazy because like, why is this funny? But once you see it again performed, you can get a lot of that bickering sense. We know a lot about that. Through the action and through the expressions and so forth. But it is really great to see how these characters will play out. And yeah, like you mentioned, Lindsay, how is this going to influence the rest of their relationship throughout the play? Like, do they, when they see each other, do they have that moment of like, oh, they're actually pretty attractive and I'm kind of interested? Or is it like, oh yeah, this is the shrew I've got to tame, and she's just like, oh, another dude coming here to probably court my sister or something. Like there's all that interplay at the very first sight, and then all the way through, talk of tails and tongues and all that, and stingers and everything there. It's interesting to see, are they playful about it? Are they vicious about it?
Yeah.
There's so much latitude there that it is really interesting.
Yeah. So we've seen this a couple of times performed, and I think the one that I remember most clearly was a local production that was set during the Klondike Gold Rush, the Free Will Shakespeare Festival, and they had it kind of a cute reference to Klondike Kate. I remember that very clearly. Yeah. Klondike Kate being kind of the mascot sort of for the Klondike Days, our annual summer festival here in Edmonton. So, and that one I thought, I do remember very clearly seeing that interplay as being slightly more flirtatious than, I've never seen one where there's absolutely zero attraction between Petruchio and Katharina.
Yeah.
But when you read it on the page, there's just, and this is the problem with Shakespeare, is that you can't really just read it. You have to see them performed. So it's one of the reasons why we also watched 3 different adaptations. Well, I watched 3. You watched 2 adaptations of this play. And the one that everybody talks about is the 1967 Zeffirelli version with Elizabeth Taylor and Richard Burton. And then that one, I like the fact, Aidan, you brought this up, that them seeing each other a little bit before, or at least Katharina kind of like summing him up or surveying him. What's the word I'm looking for?
Yeah, surveying works.
Before they actually meet is really interesting. And there's lots of scenes in that film of Katharina looking through windows to see things and looking through glass and peering out and seeing, just from her vantage point, she's seeing a sliver of something, but she's intrigued enough to kind of go with it. And there is a very clear sense that what she is feeling is attraction. Yeah. Have you ever seen a production or anything that you remember where you get the sense that they hate each other?
Do they actually hate each other?
Or that at least Katharina hates Petruchio?
No, because I think we've seen most of the same versions. So no, I agree.
Well, I'm just wondering if maybe you remember them differently than I do.
No, I do. I remember especially the Gold Rush one. I thought that one was really well done for building that sense of, okay, these are 2 people who are feeling each other out. They're physically attracted, and then as the wordplay starts building throughout the scene, they become intellectually attracted, I would say, to each other as well. But I think it's definitely possible to read it. I mean, there is, at one point she slaps him, which I think was omitted in that version that we saw, actually. In the Zeffirelli one, she's throwing things and like hitting him with stuff and sitting on him and stuff, but it's almost a little too exaggerated to really, I mean, she's a very violent individual in the film, but here it's a little more playful at the same time as being exaggerated. In the play itself? No, in the Zeffirelli version. Okay. Whereas, in the play itself, you can read it as just like she's really angry and trying to like get rid of him, and he's the one who's kind of carrying the comedy and carrying the I guess, carrying the conversation in the sense of not letting her dissuade him, which is, again, also in the scene, because at the very start of the scene, he
says everything that she does, I'm going to say the opposite.
Oh, it's amazing.
You know, and that's a ploy. It's gaslighting. It's pure and simple what it is. And that's not a term that Shakespeare's contemporaries would have used, but that's exactly what it is. And that's what makes the Christopher Sly induction scene so interesting as well. And we haven't talked about that yet, but the fact that he just it's what he uses to keep her talking, because she's so incredulous. Like, you know, I'm not fair, Kate. I'm not, you know, and that can be played as well as if you've been told your whole life, or for the host of your adult life, that you're not worthy of marriage, that no one wants to marry you, and that your sister is this beautiful thing and you're ruining her life. The minute somebody comes by and says, actually, you're fair, Kate, you're lovely and you're beautiful and everything like that, you probably would say, what are you talking about? Are you crazy? And so there can be an element of, and that's what makes Petruchio an interesting character, because he starts off almost in a place of, you know, his father's died, so he's grieving, and it's unclear if in the film version, the Zeffirelli version, it seems like he's not as wealthy as maybe, well, he's certainly not as wealthy as the Minolas.
No.
But he's interested in her dowry, and he wants to know how much money she brings to the table. It's almost like this is for money. He's only doing it for money, or doing it to secure some kind of future for himself now that his father's gone. So if you play it that way, then it is just a craven transaction. Yeah. But if you play it, and it's possible to play it from the words, if you play it as Katharina being told she's lovely, and Petruchio maybe feeding into that, and maybe that's how love blossoms between the two of them, it is possible to read it that way. And I think that's what I like about this play.
Yeah.
Even though it does go to some very, very dark places when he begins this process of quote unquote taming her.
So let's talk about that. Let's talk about the taming process and how you think that kind of works out. So he does a lot of things. Yeah, he gaslights her by, you know, basically telling, oh, well, I mean, the most notable example is on the way back to Padua for the other wedding, they come across Vincentio, and they're like, oh, it's a
Vincentio
woman.
is Lucentio's father very confusingly.
Yeah. And, you know, Petruchio has her call him a fair maiden,
and she goes along with it because she's been through this process of
trying to
sleep
resist.
deprivation, and she's been denied food and clothing, and she's cold. She's like, all of these things are being forced upon her in a really, it's incredibly difficult to read, and it's really hard to watch. I had a lot of trouble.
Yeah, you were very upset while we were watching Zeffirelli.
Because I'd never seen it before, and it was really cruel because the camera lingers on Elizabeth Taylor's face, and she's so beautiful, and she's so sad. She's so bewildered by this process. Yeah. Like it really hits home that this is a woman who has been under the yoke of her father, and then the first man that comes along that shows an interest to her treats her like shit. Yeah. And it's so awful.
But I think the important thing is treating her like shit, but pretending to treat her well. Because I think that was an interesting distinction. Again, we've been reading the Folger's Shakespeare versions of the plays, and the essay at the back talked a little bit about what the antecedents to this play are in the Italian and Latin traditions, especially. Right. And in those ones, usually when they were taming a woman, they would just beat her. Like, it would be physical torture. Yeah. And so this is like a slight improvement, I guess.
Yeah, it's like, here, I'll put a roof over your head, and oh, here's food. Oh, but it's cooked too much, so we're not going to eat tonight.
Yeah, it's not good enough.
It's not good enough for you. Yeah. So it's cruel to be kind, which is exactly what I will kill her with kindness. Yeah. And that's what makes it so hard, is that they're really, and if you bring that up, and people who have been in abusive relationships have done this, they're gaslit again, like, oh, I'm doing this for your benefit. And you really can't see, like, there's a way to see it through the abuser's eyes, and to say, oh, well, maybe that food really wasn't good, or really this bed isn't good enough. The clothes aren't clean enough, or whatever. So it's what makes it so insidious and hard to watch.
But I mean, and I think in the play it's less clear because she throws it as like a switch, and I think that's where a lot of people read the ending as a little less satirical? Depressing. Yes, a little more satirical, because especially it's in that scene with Vicentio where she's like, oh, am I gonna follow through with calling him a maid? No. And then he's like, well, then we'll leave. And she's like, okay, I'll do it.
Yeah.
And it's literally that fast. She's like, okay, I know what you want. I'll just do it for that sake.
Yeah.
Not because I actually believe that Vicentio is a woman,
right,
but because I know you're going to be a little bitch about it until I do it.
Well, and
right?
the same with calling the sun the moon or the moon the sun or whatever. Yeah. It's not because she believes it. She's not. And I remember talking about this in our Shakespeare class that we took in university, where I think our professor mentioned that there's, at this point, she's tired. Katharina is tired and she's sleep deprived. She's hungry. So psychologically, she's worn out. So she's just going to go along with whatever he says. In the Taylor-Burton enactment of this scene, she's much more calculating about it. And so I think that's a big difference, because from reading the play, you don't get that sense. But you can, again, it comes down to the interpretation that the director or the filmmaker or whoever puts into the play itself when they're producing it, because it is so easy to read it either way. Yeah. You know?
Well, I don't know about reading it. Again, when you just read the text in a lot of cases, it comes across as her being very just beaten down, and like you could wait. Hold on a second. I'm just going to find the text that I want to talk about here. So this is the whole moon-sun passage, and they're back and forth about whether it's the moon or the sun. And this is on right before they meet Vicentio. And it's Hortensio who actually jumps in and says, say as he says, or we shall never go.
Yeah, right.
And then she says, okay, forward I pray, since we have come so far, and be it moon or sun or what you please. And if you please to call it a rush candle, henceforth I vow it shall be so for me. Mm. That, to me, that very much sounds like a woman who's just given up.
Yeah.
And she's explicitly saying, because we've gone so far, I just don't want to go back. I am beaten down by this. And I realize I'm just kind of contradicting myself, because earlier I'd mentioned that she just on a dime switches it here. And she does switch it, but
once Vicentio comes in, and she does, because there's no sense of that in the text itself. But I see what you're saying, because when you read it out, it does sound like she's just browbeaten to the point of, I don't care anymore. Yeah. Like, call it whatever. Yeah. But I guess that can be played either way still. That's my point, is that it's really still up to the production.
Yeah, and I honestly can't remember in the Zeffirelli if they even had the moon and stars, or if it was just...
No, they did.
Okay.
I'm pretty sure they did.
Yeah, okay. I thought so too, but I couldn't remember.
But I wasn't really watching at that point, because I was really mad.
You were really mad. But, there are productions where it could just start with Vicentio. Like, you could cut that moon and sun stuff, and then you lose a bit of that context as well. So, it's an interesting switch, and this is really kind of the important scene where it leads into the climax of the play.
Something that I read when we were doing a little bit of research for this was that, it's been glossed over in our conversation so far, but the falconry imagery and the falconry language that comes up. And so falconry is not something that is very common anymore, but at the time it would have been understood as a given. Like, this is a sport that, a man of Petruchio's caliber would engage in. And he does talk about Katharina. He comments that she's like a cat, right? And he's making those references, but he talks about the taming process as being like breaking a falcon or taming a falcon. Yeah. And in that case, when you tame a falcon, it's something like you do sleep deprive your falcon, and you do deny it food. Yeah. But you don't sleep either. Yeah. Right? And that is something that Petruchio does in this play. Yeah. That he, when he says, oh, well, we won't eat tonight. We'll, I forget the language that he uses, but, he's not going to eat either. And if she's not going to sleep because I'm going to keep her up all night, if she starts to nod off, I'll just keep ranting and railing so she wakes up again. Right? And so it is a punishment for him. I don't see it as a punishment for him.
Well, because he's choosing to do it.
Yeah, exactly.
that's the
And
difference.
Katharina has no agency or anything over it. Even the fact that he calls her Kate, I've been trying really hard to call her Katharina because Kate is not her name, and he calls her that in an act of defiance.
Yeah. He says, "My name's Katharina." He says, "No, you're Kate."
Yeah, and
it's the first thing he says to her.
And if you rename somebody, I mean, that's a power move, right?
Yeah.
Like you're taking away what they are, their name. So I mean, that kind of pisses me off. So I'm sorry that I called her Kate a minute ago, but anyway, so that idea I think gets lost on modern crowds, modern readers, because we don't have that falconry
metaphor in mind.
Or the references in our society any longer. So it's important to note that this is, and it may have been interpreted at the time as being, I mean, it's still kind of shitty because she's not an animal, but in the great chain of being, she's not far above an animal. So again, the contemporary audience would have understood that and would have seen that as being completely normal or understandable. But we haven't even talked about how Petruchio isn't exactly a catch himself.
Yes, and that was a really interesting point, because I had never considered this point of view the many times I've seen the play before, or the time I read it earlier in university. But I mean, there's a way to look at this as Petruchio actually being the shrew who gets tamed at the end of the play.
Yeah, I suppose you could, right?
Because like you said, he doesn't behave as society would dictate either. We see that all throughout the play, especially in the Zeffirelli version. I mean, when he shows up the first time, even before Kate's even been mentioned.
Oh man, he's yelling.
He's
drunk. He's beating people up in the streets. Yeah. He's just, he's Richard Burton, so he's going to get away with anything. Yeah. So from the minute you see him that this is someone who clearly doesn't have a clue about how to behave in a normal society, and the people around him call him out on it
exactly
before he's even met Katharina.
Yeah, and it's interesting because at the end, ostensibly, he, at least, especially in the Zeffirelli version again, he's cleaned up, and a big part of that is from Katharina coming to his home. She sets his house into order.
Yes, dusts the chandelier,
gets all the servants working properly, creates a sense of order, and none of that is in the text. So that was entirely the directorial choice. And it's an interesting one because it really does further that idea that Petruchio is also the one who's being reformed.
Yeah, he needed a wife badly.
Exactly. He needed the wife.
And this is something, the Zeffirelli version coming out in 1967, kind of at the cusp of the the second wave feminist movement. It's important to note that the context in which that film has been created or was created, because this would not have gone over very well for modern audiences at the time, contemporary audiences, if he had been, browbeating Katharina into submission when you've got, fights and marches for women's rights all over the world. So, I mean, it's in other versions, and I'm thinking, I'm thinking specifically of the Klondike Kate one that we watched. The Petruchio character comes in as almost like this bold, cocksure, paragon almost.
Yes, yeah.
And there's no reason that you could read him otherwise, aside from a few lines in the play where other people refer to him as mad. But it's easy to read that all as an act.
Exactly. And because he explicitly says as much. He's like, I will basically be crazy around her to make her... We set her off kilter, basically.
Exactly. So again, depending on the interpretation, you can play it as just an act. He shows up like Malvolio in Twelfth Night, cross-gartered. He shows up to the wedding wearing this madcap outfit that he looks ridiculous. Beats up the priest and swears in church and throws some glasses around and food and everything. But in the Zeffirelli version, which is really interesting, and that, again, hadn't thought of this until I watched it, he's not a catch. It's possible to see this as he just doesn't know how to behave.
Yeah.
And so Katharina coming in and and making the best of this situation like she does by cleaning up his home.
Yeah.
It does kind of underscore or reinforce this notion that he needed her as much as she, quote unquote, needed him.
Yeah.
And I think she did need him in the end, just because being in the situation she was in was not good for her either. And Bianca's not. I mean, we haven't even touched on this comic subplot. Did we want to talk about that at all?
Well, we should, because
Bianca really bothers me, and so I think even if we spent 5 minutes talking about this,
Sure. Well, why don't you start with that? Why does Bianca bother you?
because she is not. I mean, she's the worst kind of woman. She's the kind of woman.
Wow.
No, I'm serious, and I say that as someone who is. I am an ardent feminist. But I see women who do this and I say, oh, you're setting yourself back. You know, if you just, you know, you do your hair nice and you bat your eyelashes and you get what you want. I mean, I guess it's a kind of agency, but you're also playing right into the patriarchal standards of the time. And in the end, she is roundly chastised by her sister for behaving in such a way, you know. And
yeah,
I don't want to say rightly so, but she is a bitch. Like, she is.
Wow.
Right? She is.
That's interesting.
You didn't think so?
No, especially...
So you think Bianca's this perfect woman,
well,
or
I think,
what?
Yeah, I think she's another terrible archetype of the perfect woman of the time period. Not my particular flavor, but sure. And that's interesting because... That is not how I think most productions would portray her. Even in Zeffirelli, where Katharina is kind of the hero of the play at the end of the day. Her and Petruchio's back and forth is the whole film. Like the rest of the subplot is basically buried. And there, Bianca is just kind of a blonde, kind of ditzy woman.
Yeah.
But she's not necessarily mean or harsh. Even, I mean, when at one point Baptiste has to break them up because they're fighting, Katharina and Bianca are, and he says, like, she's never done anything wrong to you.
But I don't see that as being true, because and here's the thing. I've been around a lot of mean girls. Okay, I've been around a lot of mean girls. Okay, I teach junior high.
Yeah,
they're everywhere, and they know how to manipulate people. She's got her father wrapped around her finger, so of course Baptista is not going to say, "Bianca, stop being mean to your sister." I see this as being Katharina is put down and downtrodden the entire play. Yes. And the only person she has any power over is her younger sister.
That's true.
It's not right for her to be mean to her sister, but I don't think that Bianca does anything to encourage Katharina to be nice either. She's probably, in any production you see, she's like, why are you doing this to me? Like, you are the cause of all of my, like, of course Katharina's going to be like, fuck you. Like, you know, this
wow.
maybe if you weren't if we could band together, power to the, girl power, sisterhood, hashtag. I don't know. I just have a problem with Bianca. I just see her as being very manipulative because she's beautiful, and that's part of the problem. Sure.
And I agree. Most productions I've seen, even the other one that we'll talk about that is not Shakespeare, features that quite prominently. That Bianca is very perfect in a societal sense, but very self-centered.
And that comes out after she gets married, right?
Yes.
It's like she's perfect. She's this wonderful person. And then they get married and she's like, I'm not going to come out when my husband calls. And I've seen that too. I have friends who are like, they go all out for their wedding and then they go home and then they browbeat their husbands. And it's like, no, this is a union of two people who should, and in that respect, Petruchio and Katharina are the ultimate couple. Yeah. And you can read the ending that way. Sure. They're one person, they're one unit, and they trust each other. Katharina trusts Petruchio not to step on her hand if she puts her hand under his foot. Yeah. And he won't do that because there's a mutual trust and respect there. And Bianca doesn't have that with Lucentio at all. And never will. Or it's at least not to the point that Katharina and Petruchio have.
Because there's no mutual respect there.
Yes, there's none.
It's very much just like, well, you wanted me so badly that you were willing to do all this. Yeah. So therefore, I don't have to really listen to you. Like, there's a power imbalance at the start of the relationship. Yeah. But that makes it sound like Petruchio and Katharina are the emblem of a healthy start to a relationship, which it is not.
And that's what confuses the hell out of me. Because I don't think they are, but yet they are. And that fucks me up, man. Like, I don't know what to say anymore.
That is interesting. Because, well, I mean, in some ways, like, again, we're going back to that one section of the text when they first meet. They are so evenly matched.
They are.
And that is in the text. That is, I mean, their wordplay back and forth.
It's like
about
line by line, line for line.
Amazing.
They just fire back. Like, she is one of Shakespeare's wittiest female characters.
Yeah.
And it leaps off the page.
Yeah.
And it's interesting that her longest speech comes at the end of the play after she has gained a modicum of control over her life, which she never had when she was living under her father's roof. Mm-hmm. She never had before she was married. And all of a sudden she's the lady of Petruchio's house, and she is able to speak this hugely long speech. It's one of the longest speeches in the play.
Yeah, I mean,
so does she get her voice as a result of this?
Yeah, but it's a result of giving in. And that's
right. So yeah. It's messy.
It's messy.
What's mine is yours. And what is yours is mine.
What are some of the other productions that
Well, you watched another one that I did not. It was the early. Was it the first talkie version of Shakespeare? It was.
It was the first filmed version of Shakespeare, as far as I know. So the first time Shakespeare was put on film, and it's a Douglas Fairbanks, Mary Pickford production from 1929, 1930, 31, something like that. So early talkie. An hour long. It's very
it's condensed.
And it's fun to watch. That I like watching them anyway, because those old films are just full of, I don't know, I just love those silent films and the early talkies, black and white stuff. The acting is so over the top, and everything like that, even though they're talking. But again, it's interesting because here you have, Douglas Fairbanks, Mary Pickford at the end of their marriage, when they were fighting and not getting along very well, and still, putting in this passionate performance. In fact, there were a lot of people who thought that maybe Fairbanks was taking out a lot of his anger on Pickford in the role of Petruchio beating up Katharina. But they're electric on screen, really, and they always were, but they are especially here. And what I liked about that ending is that there's this literal, Pickford looking at winking at the end of her speech, and so it's very, very blatant that she doesn't actually believe what she says about, that you owing something to your husband. And so while she's, screaming at her, well, not screaming, but she's chastising her sister and the old widow. So that was interesting in that it's good to watch it from a historical perspective as the first Shakespeare film, but also for this very blatant satirical take on the ending. The key ending. And interesting also that it comes, very shortly after white women were given the right to vote, and first wave feminism had really kind of taken off with things like the temperance movement and stuff, really exerting control and everything in the United States for sure. So it's of its time as well. Yeah. And then also for that satirical ending, I think is really because it's so obvious, right? Yeah, exactly. We talked a lot about the Zeffirelli one, and it is a fairly good version. I think one of the more interesting things is how much of the comic subplot about Lucentio and Hortensio and wooing Bianca and all that is really pared down. It's almost nothing. There's, the ending, which is in the play, is kind of a big deal about, Lucentio and Bianca have gone off and gotten married, and there's a fake Vincentio and, to pose and all this. It gets condensed down into one scene basically, and it's over really fast. And the apology to allow him to be married to her is because he never sought permission from his father to marry Bianca either.
And Bianca's father was misled as to who Vincentio actually was. Exactly. So they really need to beg forgiveness of both fathers, and it happens in like 2 seconds flat. Like it's really rushed, and again, the main focus of the film is on Petruchio and Katharina. So I thought it's really interesting that way, because it gives it room to do all those in between the text items like the wedding and her cleaning up the house and there's a very long sequence of him leading her back after they've left Padua to his home. And there's like, it feels like almost like a musical number because it's so well choreographed. They come home and there's all these servants running about and creating chaos and stuff. It's quite colorful.
None of it is in the play.
Yeah.
And a lot of the acting is done silently with, like we said, Elizabeth Taylor looking through windows or glances being exchanged or running around. And so the story is told in a very different way than it is when you watch the play or in any of the other
sure. Definitely.
productions.
It's very, very different. And that, I mean, that again goes to the core of how adaptable Shakespeare is.
But it's interesting that, with Taylor and Burton, I mean, they were married. They were still happily married at this point.
Oh, was it? Okay. I thought they divorced soon after.
No, they were a couple years, 7 years or something after that, I think. I don't know. For the first time. Then they got remarried and right. But for them to have this starring role in a film playing lovers, and it was like their comeback film, I read that and it did really, really well. Like it was a hit. It was a huge hit at the box office. So and it really reaffirmed their combined star power on screen. So I mean, that's just interesting. It does seem like a lot of times when you see these films or this play put on, it's done by a husband and wife team, which must be weird to see or to perform.
What does it say about marriage that the one where they have to fight basically the entire play is the one?
We can't do this believably unless we get an actual married couple on stage
who have gone through this. It is funny, and just to speak to the ending of that one, it is played fairly straight. It seems like she really is believing this, but then at the end there's this interesting thing where her last line has been spoken, the wedding cheers, and then she takes off and he turns and looks for her, and all the other women are kind of obscuring his path to her. And I thought that's an interesting take.
It is.
Because it's not the wink. It's not the wink at the camera, but it's questioning it. It's how much of that did she actually believe?
Well, and I mean the other thing about that one is that there are a lot of, like we said, scenes where you get Elizabeth Taylor alone doing something, and she's often, well, there's one very clear scene where her father agrees that they'll be married, and she's been locked in a room by Petruchio, and she looks out the window and she sees this conversation happening, and he leaves, and she kind of sinks down to the table she's pushed up to the door to look out the window, and she smiles to herself like she's secretly pleased. And you don't know if that's because she likes Petruchio or if it's because she just wants to be married, just because every woman wants to be married.
But you got the sense it was more she liked him.
Because this comes right after they've had this repartee back and forth. So
which even in that scene there was a portion where they were separated, and she has this big smile on her face.
Exactly, and, right.
She really seemed to engage with him on that verbal level, and it really helped cement the relationship. Which adds to the sense of, well, how much of this is her own doing, how much of this speech that's ostensibly about obeying her husband is her own machinations to get him into line. Right.
Exactly. So is that at the end of the Zeffirelli version, especially, who has been tamed, really? That's what made me question it too. So it's all kinds of fascinating if you look at it this way. The third version of this film, quote unquote version, it's a really loose adaptation from 1999, 10 Things I Hate About You, starring Heath Ledger and Julia Stiles as the titular characters. Well, the Shrew of the time, the original, and the Petruchio character.
And it's very 90s.
That's all Aidan could say. Seriously, I swear to God, we were watching this movie. He's like, "This is so 90s," and he's like pulling out his hair. And
I said it like at least 20 dozen
he's
times.
He's online looking for Crystal Pepsi afterwards. Digs out his old SNES. He's just like gone full 90s now, guys. It's ridiculous.
So fun. It's fun to watch though, just because we grew up in that era, and I've seen so many of those. I mean, it was American Pie.
She's all that. I mean, it's all of those films. The soundtrack, and there's ska. Like I haven't heard a ska soundtrack since I watched Clueless, which was also from the 90s. So I mean, it's a very interesting adaptation, but it's very, very, very loose adaptation. Like it takes the basic
story
plot
that you described of the sister who can't date, and it's dating instead of marriage. But the one sister who can't date until her older sister starts. Exactly.
And they're in high school, and there's a bit of a subplot with Joseph Gordon-Levitt and Larissa Olenek is the Bianca character. And he's her French tutor, but he doesn't actually know French. And so there's that going on. But I think that also plays into this idea that I have that Bianca's not nice because this Bianca character is dumb. And like she's that stereotypical 90s dumb blonde,
but
right?
She has a redeeming moment at the end, which Bianca doesn't have, which is that she's initially attracted to the dumb, equally mean 90s archetype boyfriend of he's an underwear model or something. But you know, she goes out with him on a date and then she realizes how vain and useless he is. Yeah. And that's when she decides to go back to Joseph Gordon-Levitt's character.
Yeah. She dumps Andrew Keegan
to go
Joseph Gordon-Levitt, which 90s me would not have understood.
But now you're like, oh my God, one of them still has a career.
Well, but except that Joseph Gordon-Levitt has spent the whole play or the whole movie lying to her. But
But we should talk about that. I think it's interesting to say that the play is steeped in a kind of 90s feminism, and Julia Stiles' character is an advocate of this girl power. In fact, Bikini Kill's reference as a few other feminist bands of the age. But the movie itself is not very feminist. I mean, the stuff that Heath Ledger, the pickup lines, because in this one he's bribed to take her out on a date by what's the actor's name that you just mentioned?
Joseph Gordon-Levitt or Andrew Keegan.
They both basically wind up telling him to do this, and then he falls in love with her, of course. But the initial pickup lines he uses on her are like terrible things, like, oh, but you thought about me naked, right? Like just stuff like that. That's like it's very cringeworthy now, but in the 90s I'm sure it was like, oh yeah, well, Heath Ledger's gorgeous, of course you're gonna picture it.
Well, and then there's this all, like, I mean, we've evolved a little bit since 1999. It's 20 years ago, but the idea that the Kate character, Julia Stiles' character, had a sexual relationship and it hadn't gone well, and there's, you know, questions of consent and stuff that are brought up that not explicitly, but they just leave this uncomfortable taste. So it's a weird play to want to adapt in this way, is how I felt. I didn't really feel like, usually when you see an adaptation, like Clueless is a good example because it's an adaptation of Emma. Yeah. And it's done cleverly. I mean, Amy Heckerling, you can't get mad at Amy Heckerling for anything. But she did it in such a way that everything has everything from the original has a modern day equivalent,
parallel, exactly.
A parallel.
Yeah.
And this, there wasn't enough. And it was there to make kind of a comment about high school social structures and stuff that 10 Things I Hate About You just felt like, oh, we're gonna do Shakespeare but in Seattle and take advantage of grunge and that's it. It didn't really feel like it was smart about it.
It started off trying to be really smart, like it has like the nerd character showing off all the different cliques of stuff, which is a very 90s. Again,
huge.
I have to say, like, that whole idea of like,
these are the posers, these are the goths, these are the nerds,
hippies, and like it's
as they walk through the campus, you know, the quad or whatever
of Padua High School.
So no, it was Verona High School.
No, it was Padua.
Was it Padua?
I'm sure it was Padua. Yeah, it was Padua High. Yeah. Anyways, I mean, there was all that, but it's very steeped in the moment. I mean, in that way, it is a great time capsule. But in terms of the feminism it talks about, it does not match with the feminism that's portrayed. Yeah. And that's kind of the tough thing to watch. It's more of, like, if you're talking about girl power, it's a little more Spice Girls girl power rather than like Bikini Kill. Like, that's kind of
even though Julia Stiles' character, like, her feminism extends only so far as it looks cool. You know what I mean? Like, she dresses unconventionally. She wears clothes that would have marked her off as either a 90s feminist or a 90s lesbian, right? And that is, I mean, it's very hard to watch it seriously just because it is so 90s and it's hard to divorce yourself from that. But yeah, like, the things that she espouses, you know, sitting there reading Sylvia Plath, that's her moment of depth, right?
She's so deep.
Or knowing where to find Betty Friedan's The Feminist Mystique in the bookstore, right?
Yeah, it's all second wave feminism stuff that they're actually referencing. But when you're in the third wave, like, it felt very dated already for being. I mean, there were ways to be a feminist
if it had been if they were trying, and I don't think they were, if they had been trying to make a statement about third wave feminism or something, they would have had more something between the Heath Ledger character and Julia Stiles, Kate and the Petruchio.
And that's the really hard part, is that, you know, the climax of this one is that she finds out he was being bribed to do this. She gets mad at him, of course, and storms off. And then the very next day, she has a poem about how much she misses him. Yeah, and that's the whole resolution, is just the fact that she basically gave in. She was tamed by this guy who, I mean, he's much nicer than Petruchio.
Oh yeah, and he doesn't. Of course, he doesn't deny her food or or anything like that. He's just a little bit. I think the thing that, like, his version of taming her is that he pretends he doesn't like her. And that's supposed to be what girls want. Like, a dude who ignores you is the guy that you want to go for or something. Yeah,
it's a very strange process in the film, because he starts off like he's the one who approaches her, but then he's like, oh, but, you know, I'm not really that interested. But then he is super interested. So then he can make that shift from someone who's uninterested to interested. You know, he takes care of her and, like, helps her out when she's been drinking too much. And, you know,
and listens to her that she wants to start a band and buys her a guitar with the money that he was bribed with, you know. And she ends up with a Fender Stratocaster in her car. Yeah. And that's how they make up at the end.
Yeah,
it's confusing. It doesn't, and maybe that's not the point. We're reading too much into it. It's a 90s teen flick, so let's not try and make it the Bible. But
no, but it is interesting that these are the movies that we grew up watching, and these were the kind of messages that were very muddled at the time. You know, it was it was still a very male centric view of how to fix a relationship. You buy her a guitar and apologize after she's read you a poem in class. And it is very strange, right? But it is still a very... It does not dive into Julia Stiles' head nearly enough. No. For... her name is Katharina in the movie as well, by the way. So it doesn't jump into Katharina's head nearly enough for us to feel like she is actually the central character, even though she is the central character of the movie, and the play. In the movie, you don't get much of that except for the surface level feminism stuff that they talk about.
And a little bit of the father character is an obstetrician gynecologist who is so worried about his daughters becoming pregnant that he makes them wear a fake pregnant belly to dissuade them from having sex, and won't let his daughter go to Sarah Lawrence College, even though she applies, and he won't allow her to go because he doesn't want her to be that far away from him. And it's a very controlling, I mean, it updates the Baptista Minola character for a modern audience, but it inherits the chastity virtue from Shakespeare, and a little too on the nose, like very much so. With the fears of the 90s and teen pregnancy and all that stuff, teen drinking, teen drugs, all of that plays a very central role. But again, if it's trying to make a feminist statement, it fails in that regard, because they don't really explain. I mean, the mother ran off, I think, and there's not really any reason for the father to be this overbearing, except that there's this extended metaphor he gives about being, you know, how Katharina has benched him. There's a baseball metaphor, and he wants to be on the team, but she's benched him for years because you're an overbearing twat. Like, I don't know. I just have a hard time with this movie. Yeah. I mean, it's not a great movie. No. So, I mean, again, we are reading in a little bit, but I just thought it was interesting that, especially as a Shakespeare adaptation that I've seen. Were so many. And there really were. There was that other one, She's the Man, with Amanda Bynes, where which is an adaptation of Twelfth Night, and like Romeo and Juliet, Baz Luhrmann's Romeo and Juliet is kind of the standard.
There's which was also Julia Stiles.
Yes, that's right. So, I mean, it was a time for these adaptations to come up, and you think there are really good ones out there, and then there are ones like this that it's baffling to me. And I've heard from people who show this when they teach the Taming of the Shrew. They show this to their high school classes or junior high school classes when they learn it. And I don't see, unless you're going to talk about all the ways that it's different and do some kind of comparison study. You would need, like, we watched it shortly after we watched the Zeffirelli, and drawing the contrast there was very easy. And I think that would work well. Maybe it would. Maybe it would. But
on its own, it's far too loose to talk about what Shakespeare brought to it. I mean, there's like going back to the one section that we really like about the back and forth, that doesn't even exist in this movie at all.
No.
Like they kind of meet, and he doesn't have the verbal skills that she exposes at all. So they're not even really a match in that sense, which is the best part, frankly, of the text itself and most productions, is the fact that they are equally matched.
So it takes everything that attracts Petruchio and Katharina potentially in the play and reduces it to
kind of 90s
Heath Ledger
stereotypes.
is beautiful and Julia Stiles is beautiful, so of course they're going to be together. And
they're both outside. They're both outcasts.
Yes,
her
I
because
suppose.
of her feminism,
and him because he's mysterious
Yeah.
and may have been in jail or something, and has an Australian accent,
Yeah.
which is never really addressed. I mean, he was born there, he says. I don't know.
No.
But either way, it's just not. It's an enjoyable film. Maybe if you don't know that it's based on Shakespeare, you wouldn't know from the ending, aside from the weird Shakespeare references that are brought up by the nerd character.
Yeah. And she has to rewrite one of the sonnets.
Oh yes, that's right.
Which is the 10 Things poem that is.
Either way, it's just it's a film that happens, and we watched it, and it's not the greatest, but it exists.
And Alison Janney's in it as
Alison Janney's
erotica writing principal or something.
No,
like
she's
that.
a guidance counselor.
Guidance counselor, yes.
Which is like my dream. That would be not to be a guidance counselor, but to write erotic fan fiction at my desk and not be.
Please don't do
in
that. You
trouble
are a
for
teacher,
it.
Lindsay.
No, I know that. It's just like that's so unbelievable as a plot point.
Yeah.
As was Alison Janney's hairstyle in the film.
Yeah.
Just gonna throw that out there.
Have it be coward!
Can we briefly talk about the Christopher Sly induction scene in the frame narrative?
Yes,
we haven't talked about yet.
We skipped over that a bit, yeah.
Because it's easy to, because none of the filmed versions that I've ever seen, and I've only seen 3, but none of them, and even often the productions.
The one we saw did not have
They skip it entirely. Yeah. And it changes the way you read the play. In fact, I had forgotten that the induction scene even existed
right?
until I read an essay that talked about it being this play within a play, or a dream within a play, or something. Yeah. Because the Christopher Sly induction scene has this character who has passed out drunk in a pub, and some rich guy comes by and says, I want to play a prank on this guy. We're going to dress him up in my clothes, put him in my bed, and when he comes to, we're going to convince him that he's rich and wealthy, and then we're going to put on this play for him, and it's going to be great. And Christopher Sly is obviously very confused when he wakes up, because he doesn't remember having a wife, and he doesn't remember having livery, and he doesn't remember having more than one suit to choose from when he, gets dressed in the morning. Yeah. And if that frame narrative leads into Act 1, Scene 1. So it exists outside of the play, which is probably why it's very easy to just cut it out. And because it doesn't end, there is no return to induction, reprise, or whatever you want to call it. There's no outro for this play. Yeah. You just cut it entirely. But I think Taming of a Shrew deals with it. There is an ending to this Christopher Sly bit where they drop him off in front of his house, and he thinks to himself, the play that he's just watched has given him the inspiration to tame his own shrewish wife. But he is this ridiculous character who's been lied to and is just a bumbling drunken fool. You're not supposed to look at that and say, yeah, actually, I'm going to do what that Christopher Sly did, and I'm going to go home and tame my wife.
Exactly.
You're supposed to say, wow, that's a dumb thing to do because Christopher Sly wants to do it, right? Yeah,
and that totally changes the interpretation of the whole ending of everything, right?
Yeah.
And the fact that it doesn't exist in The Shrew is I think for most readers, they'll just ignore the induction entirely. Yeah. And I feel like that's one of the things that A. Shrew would probably have done a lot better is connecting the two plays.
Yeah.
Because the play within the play of...
Which is all Katharina Petruchio, the Taming, everything.
Exactly. That is the majority of it, but I feel like the frame narrative does provide a frame through which to view the... realism of the taming process, because at the end he believes it was a dream.
Yes,
and I feel like that's how the audience is kind of guided to have. You should view this as this doesn't really happen, guys. This taming process is stupid, and you shouldn't follow it.
But if you ignore that entirely, if
Yeah.
you don't even address the induction, and if you don't address the fact that this play was ostensibly intended to be a play within a play / dream within a play,
Yeah.
then you miss out. You start to view it as being this is real. This
Yeah,
is how
this is
people
very
actually did this.
Exactly.
But is there any evidence that men went out there and deprived their
it probably did
cantankerous
happen.
wives of sleep so that they would stop being shrewish?
I mean, probably because it was a terrible
Maybe.
age to be a woman, but at the same time, I don't feel
that.
like Shakespeare was necessarily endorsing it that way.
Exactly. And
It was almost his way of finding the balance between society will tell you that women should be tamed, and this is how you do it.
But
and then,
is that
but
really
is
the way
it?
to do
Because
it?
I mean, Christopher Sly, you wouldn't trust this guy to like tame an already tamed cat. Like, yeah, there's no way he could do any of this because he's such an idiot.
maybe you shouldn't try it.
Yeah,
either.
maybe you shouldn't try it.
Like
Exactly.
it does make it feel even more radical than it already is when you talk about the things we talked about, young people bucking social trends, the women bucking their place in society. Then you have this Christopher Sly character saying, should women, or making us question, should women be chaste, silent, and obedient? Yeah. And I think, I mean, again, it's hard to know what Shakespeare was thinking, and there is no ending to this. Yeah. Why? I don't know why. But did Ben Jonson forget to put it in the folio?
Maybe he didn't like it. He's like, no, women should just be tamed.
But he left in the beginning part. So
know,
what the hell?
It makes no sense, right?
Hemmings, Condell, what were they thinking?
Yeah.
When they made the folio. But either way, it's a really interesting idea, and that was what first made me think that we're dealing with a play that begins with the gaslighting of Christopher Sly. Mm-hmm. We have a character in Katharina who is gaslit to the point of fundamentally changing her character. Mm-hmm. And it's done out of malice, and maybe not malice, but we're making fun of this in Christopher Sly's induction. So how seriously can we take the middle part? Yeah. And that's something I completely forgotten the induction even existed. Yeah. So I really troubled me thinking back on the Taming of the Shrew. It really did bother me that this play existed.
Well, exactly. When you watch the Zeffirelli and it's not there, it takes away a little bit of what the entirety of the play could be about. Yeah. And I think, this is one of those instances where the fact that the folio text is all we've kind of got as a complete edition is disappointing, because if there was a really good quarto out there that was very similar text wise and had just those other things, how much of that would then become the canon version? Yeah, exactly.
Well, and I mean, the folio version isn't even the standard version for a lot of these things. The Romeo and Juliet doesn't even have the prologue in the folio. So I mean, it's hard to say how authoritative any of these texts are. We're picking and choosing. So if this were put on, it's possible, and I don't see any reason why you couldn't, take some kind of cues from a Shrew or something to maybe tack on at the end to make that feel a little bit more complete. Yeah. I haven't seen any versions that have done that. No. There's kind of purity around the text itself as we have it passed down through the ages in the canon. So maybe altering that is against the code of Shakespeare. Yeah. But the Shakespeare Code, which now sounds like a Dan Brown book.
Exactly. I was just going to say.
Anyway, that's my thought on it. I don't know.
If music be the food of love, play on.
And speaking of other plays related to this one, Lindsay, you found out about a sequel to The Taming of the Shrew.
Yeah, it's almost like Shakespeare fan fiction written during Shakespeare's lifetime, which is really interesting. It was a 1611 play by John Fletcher that featured Petruchio after the death of Katharina and his second marriage to a woman who then tames him, and it's called A Woman's Prize or The Tamer Tamed. And I mean, just briefly want to bring it up just because my interest in fan fiction. So having a story that is a continuation of an original story, and of course it's hard to say if this was actually like for sure based on Shakespeare's play. There might have been a original source material or something. Petruchio and Katharina might be like Romeo and Juliet. We just pair them together and they're just the two characters that you would put in this situation or something. So maybe not, but interesting enough that it's a considered kind of Shakespeare-adjacent
Yeah.
anyway.
Yeah. And it's basically the story is he's remarrying.
Yes.
And this time the wife Maria.
Yeah.
Basically tames him by mostly withholding sex.
Yes.
Is how it works.
So there's references to
Lysistrata
and withholding sex from a man to get him to do what you want. So it's a commentary on the taming process. It's a very interesting reversal of the storyline, which is something that I expect more from Restoration comedies that come after the Puritan Revolution and everything. But it's interesting all the same. I haven't read it. I'm gonna look for it and see if I can find it because I would like to read it because I think that's an interesting ploy. But yeah, it kind of advances the storyline a little bit if it is considered some kind of unofficial sequel. Yeah. It's just worth mentioning. Yeah.
And you mentioned Lysistrata. I thought one last thing about the text itself that I thought was interesting, we chatted about it a bit, was there's a lot more allusions in this than there were in Two Gentlemen of Verona. So for another early work to feature a lot of Roman and Greek mythology references.
References to Xanthopy and all these characters from
and stuff. Yeah, like there's a lot of it, and I thought that would also actually played into the frame narrative because it's almost like Shakespeare saying, "Well, this is what most people expect from a play is high references from the Bible and all sorts of other higher literature."
Right.
And it just all goes over Christopher Sly's head.
Of course
right?
it would.
So I thought that was really interesting too, that that it's almost a little bit of a commentary on plays of the time as well.
Parting such sweet sorrow that I shall say good night till it be morrow.
So our final question
yes
that we're going to debate here and now for you is it possible to read the ending as satirical? Maybe a deeper question might be, should we read the ending as satirical?
Yeah.
Because I think it's possible to read it as satirical.
I think it's possible to perform it satirically.
Yes.
I don't think the text itself lends itself to that in any way, shape, or form.
Okay.
But yeah, let's say, should we? I will take the negative.
Surprise, surprise.
Harsh. So in my point of view, the process of breaking down Katharina is too thorough, and that passage that I mentioned earlier about the sun and the moon is just a little too blatant for me to believe that it's not a turning point in her psyche. At least when I read it again, when you see a play performed, it can be turned around a little bit more. But generally, when I'm reading the text itself and when I see a lot of the performances, she's still it's a little too much to believe that she could just turn it on and off enough to say it and not mean it. And that's kind of my interpretation, is just that when she's reached that point, I was going to say when she gotten to that point, when she has reached that point, she's just it's been too thorough of a process. It's a very quick one in the play. Yeah, I'll grant that.
Well, it's only 5 acts, so you got to wrap it up.
It's got to be quick, right? But the text itself is a little too. And maybe this will go into your point. Maybe you'll make this counterpoint, but it's a little too exact in how a woman should behave. That this is not something that she's planned in advance. It's something that's very close to her heart, and this is how she now understands her place after being beaten into it through her experiences. That's how it feels to me when I'm reading the text, especially. But Lindsay, what do you think?
Well, should the ending be read as satirical?
Yeah.
Well, yes. Obviously.
Okay.
You dum-dum. Because I'm a feminist, and I think it has to be. I don't know. Should is a harsh word. I wish I hadn't suggested that. Because obviously I think it is possible.
Yes.
It is possible to read
I will grant that it is possible.
And that's not based on just a strict reading of the text. I think that when in production, it's almost always done as kind of...
There's a satirical element.
Yes.
Least, yeah.
Whether it's very blatant, as in Mary Pickford literally winking at her sister at the end, or whether it's a little bit more subtle in, Zeffirelli, where Katharina walks away and Petruchio has to chase after her. I think there's an element of satire to it that almost everyone nowadays has to put into it, because otherwise this film becomes a film about domestic abuse and domestic violence, and we don't do that. That's just not done anymore. You don't do that.
At least you don't portray it in a positive light.
No, of course not. Of course that would be horrible. And it is horrible. And we are not in any way making light of domestic violence or anything like that. But I think the bulk of the play and the way that it's done, I have a hard time reading it now without seeing Petruchio and Catherine both as evenly matched and in need of each other. I really do. And so I think from the very beginning, when you see how their very first meeting goes and how evenly matched they are, it's impossible to view this as a power balance that isn't somehow restored at the end in equally, right?
Yeah.
And I think that ending is key to that reading, because like I said, there's a mutual trust that's established between Petruchio and Katharina, which is referenced in that falconry imagery, that she is the falcon that's been tamed, quote unquote. So, and then you have this trust that's between the falconer and the falcon, and you have this trust between Petruchio and Katharina. But I think on top of that, Petruchio, having gone through this, meeting Katharina and going through this process with her, he has fundamentally changed too. And I think if he had been exactly the same at the end, is he exactly the same at the end?
Yeah.
Like, I don't know. It's hard. On the page, it's impossible to tell. And I think on the page, knowing what I know, I would have to say it can't be, and I would have to agree with you that she's broken and it's terrible.
Oh my
and,
God.
Yeah, I know.
I win.
Savor it, Aidan.
Oh,
because
I have
to say that there's no way to put this into production without addressing the fact that, I mean, Petruchio is called mad throughout. He's not someone that is held up as a paragon of virtue himself. What business does he have taming a woman anyway?
I will grant you one element from the text. There is the passage where they're talking about they've I think it's just after their wedding, Petruchio and Katharina, where they've just left, and they're describing it off scene what happened when they were leaving, and someone says something like, "Merrily he was cated," or something like that. Yeah, and it really, that is a direct line saying, like, no, this is a two-way street for them.
Yes, exactly.
The power imbalance, though, within the text is such that you don't see much of that. But I agree. I think even productions back in the day, I think probably would have had to have featured something here, because otherwise her character there's no way she can deliver this long. It's the biggest speech in the play. Yeah. There's no way she can deliver it as a beaten down individual.
No, she's
some
gained
of her spirit
power over him in some ways, or at least and that's why I brought up the fact that she does give this speech, and it's not halting. It's not, why are you doing this, or why, it's very fluid, and it's sure. She's very sure of herself and sure of her position. And I think that it comes back to Katharina not having that in her father's house, because she's under his thumb, and her poor sister Bianca, and all of this stuff is happening with the three of them in a rather unsavory way.
It's a very unhealthy triangle there. Yeah, she
gets out from under that, and yes, she's transferred over to ownership of her is transferred to this man who is crazy, but they're evenly matched. And I think that he wants her to bestow upon him all the things he believes he is owed, but she does it in a way that in a way that helps her to assert her power in the way that she can as a wife now, which is a different status than a mother or sorry, a different status as a daughter,
yeah.
or as a single woman, as a maid.
As a maid, yeah.
You have more power. You have power over your household. You have
Yep.
power over servants who are in your household. And there's an evenness to their, and I can't ignore the fact that she says that a wife should put her hand under her husband's foot. And she's not saying because men will trample on your foot, on your hand.
Yeah.
She's saying a man who's worth his mettle is not going to hurt you.
Yeah.
And you should trust that he won't do that. And I think that is something that suggests from the textual evidence that suggests that it's not her being completely beaten down and tamed, but that she's learned something, and that the fact that Petruchio doesn't step on her hand or call her names and lets her have this whole big speech, she's never spoken this much before, nobody has, is evidence that he too has learned something about her, or learned something about himself, or learned something about marriage. And so I think they both grow into this. It's a horrible process, and I hate it 100%. But I think that there's enough in the text that it's how productions can get away with making this satirical. Plus, with that frame narrative put into place, it's again, hard because there's only half of it. Yeah. But I think the intention is there. The intent is there for this to be read as something not realistic. Yeah. And satire in and of itself is something that plays with reality.
That's a good point.
Thank you. See, I have those every once in a while.
No, you really do. And this one was a very good one because I think you kind of also won. So can we both win this one?
We can both win this one.
Yay! Happy marriage.
So whose hand is under whose boot right now?
We'll do it at the same time. Same time.
Same time. Anyway.
To be or not to be.
So this was our discussion of The Taming of the Shrew. Thank you, Lindsay, for
sharing
Aidan. Your many good points. You don't have just a few, you have many.
Aww.
See, that's how you win a woman's heart. Compliments.
Compliments. Thank you, Aidan, for opening up this space for us to have this dialogue.
And forcing you to watch 10 Things I Hate About You because you love the 90s as much as I do. And
of course.
Thank you.
I don't know what's next on our list.
I believe... no, we're starting with the Henrys. 3 parts of Henry IV.
Are we doing them all at once?
No, we're doing one play at a time,
We are going to
Lindsay.
lose all our listeners if they have to listen to us go through 3 Henrys.
We are going to make it so exciting. We are going to get out action figures.
On a podcast?
On a podcast and have them fight and do
Good
sounds
Lord.
and everything.
You don't know how this works.
No, it's going to be terrible. But we're going to do it because we're going to get through every play. And we've never read any of the Henry IV.
Never.
So we'll see how the first one goes. Maybe we will combine 2 and 3 at the end. But the first one, we're going to do Henry IV Part 1. And start the War of the Roses, and we can talk. I think there's a bunch of history discussion we can have there.
Yeah, so we'll get into that a little bit. In between, then we'll probably have our special episode. Not 100% sure what that's going to be.
We haven't decided on the topic for that one just yet, but it'll be coming up as well.
But and we're trying very hard to make the special episodes relevant to the plays nearby it. So having just done women in Shakespeare, it kind of fed into Taming the Shrew and fed from Two Gentlemen of Verona. Is it going to feed into what's going to feed into the Henrys? It's hard, but maybe we'll do maybe that's what it'll be. It'll be a history of the Wars of the Roses.
Oh, that could be interesting.
Well, I guess in a couple of weeks you'll find out. So stay tuned for that, I suppose. Until then, don't stick your tongue in anyone's tail.
Great advice, Lindsay. Thank you very much.
You're welcome. You can find all our episodes on iTunes, Spotify, Podbean, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcast fix.
If you want to tell us what you think of Shakespeare, his plays, poems, or any of the topics we discuss, we'd love to hear from you. You can contact us on Twitter, that's @TheBicksPod,
on Facebook at facebook.com/TheBicksPod, or by email at thebickspod@gmail.com. That's our cue to exit.